Hi, I am here today with a very, very inspiring person, Clarissa Ward. I've been following her for a long time. She is completely fearless, an amazing, amazing reporter. I mean, there's reporting and then there's what she does. She's the chief international correspondent on CNN. She delivers stories with a fearless nature, but also a lot of compassion, which I think is an incredibly unique balance, especially considering the places that she goes. So welcome and thanks for spending some time with me.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. I'm really
Uh,
excited to be here.
Yeah, thanks. All right. So, where did your love of storytelling come from? Was that born with it, or was there an aha moment that that came where you said, "I've got to tell the world these stories"?
I know, I think storytelling was kind of in my DNA a little bit. I was an only child. I am an only child. So I had a lot of time to kill when I was younger. And I think that like creating fantasy worlds and telling stories, and I used to read a lot of books and watch a lot of TV, and that all became, and I was very into like theater and acting and drama. And so storytelling really became the most important thing to me. And I wasn't sure initially of how to kind of channel that into something in terms of a career. I thought when I was younger, maybe I wanted to be an actress. And then when I was a senior at Yale and I was studying comparative literature, and 9/11 happened at the beginning of my senior year. And I had always loved traveling, but that was the kind of moment where it crystallized for me. First of all, that there's a big world out there, and there was a fundamental problem with communication between different parts of the world and different cultures. And I suddenly realized that the things that I love to do, whether it was telling stories or traveling or communicating, essentially, were also things that were very much needed at that time. And I think a lot of people felt the same way. 9/11 inspired people to do all different sorts of things, to, join the armed services, to become a journalist, whatever it might be. But for me, it made it very clear to me that I wanted to be a journalist, and I wanted to be traveling um, to the heart of the storm, wherever that might be.
And you've certainly been to a lot of complicated, challenging, and quite frankly, to make the viewer extremely nervous, places
Yeah.
that you go. I mean, I watch you and I've seen you running down the streets of Paris in the middle of, a horrific terrorist attack and so on. And it's just gotten progressively scarier. How is it that you find the strength? I mean, is it pure adrenaline or is there ever any fear? And how do you do what you do? Because I think a lot of people would just love to know because they can't
Mm.
imagine being in such.
I mean, so first of all, there's a lot of fear. And I'm very outspoken about this because I think it's
Well, I'm glad you admit
some,
it because a lot of people don't. People just say, "Oh
yes,
yeah, I'm good with it,"
yeah,
and that's
no.
very real, and I appreciate that.
And some people are less fearful than others. I'm quite fearful, and I am more fearful the older I get as well, because I'm more experienced. I'm more anxious, and I think at a certain point, your body almost becomes triggered. You hear a big bang, and you you go like that because you've lived through a lot of bombings, and you know what that means. So I'm very fearful. I'm extremely cautious, and I know that I do things and stories that once you see them fully edited, they look maybe even, extremely fearless or bold or brave, and usually they are the result of months and months of tireless preparations and planning, and trying to make sure that every single possible risk that can be mitigated is being mitigated. And I have done plenty of stuff on the front lines, but that's not actually my favorite thing to do, is to be sort of, I don't like being shot at. I don't love being in the midst of a gun battle. I find it extremely stressful. I am interested in getting to places that other people can't get to, primarily because I want to talk to the civilians in those areas. Because what drives me is or ordinary people and what their experience of war is. Of course, the geopolitics and the kind of military aspect of it, of these stories, are hugely important too. But the side that too often gets ignored or lost or diminished is the sort of the real human toll, the casualties, the suffering, the bravery. And those are the kinds of stories that really motivate me. And unfortunately, it's true to say that if you want to get those stories, you do often have to put yourself in dangerous positions. But as I said, I really go out of my way to try to mitigate whatever risks I can, especially now having a kid and having my little boy. You know, I have no desire to be injured or killed or lose a teammate or anything like that. Uh, and so one works as hard as one can to mitigate that risk.
It's important that you tell these stories that are the untold stories, and incredible how you do reach these people. But I think on the other side of that, I think what I'm curious about is how is it? Because I've seen you talk to people that are so completely different and so far, and their ideology is just, you cannot possibly wrap your head around it. How do you even prepare for that? How do you have a conversation realistically with someone who none of us could get? I mean, that's incredible. Yeah.
It's a good question. I mean, I think a big part of it is that I have this idea in my head. And when people ask me about journalism and what's important, I have this idea that the most fundamental thing is listening, curiosity and listening, and being willing and able to listen to people. And that doesn't mean you don't challenge them. That doesn't mean you don't take them to task, you don't question them, you don't probe them. But it does mean that you listen. You don't just wait for them to finish speaking so that you can come in with your next question. You actually sit down and open your mind and put your rehearsed questions down and be in the moment with that person and listen to what they have to say. I think in general, as a society, we have lost that ability to listen quite a lot. We are often just waiting for the other person to finish talking so we can talk. Or if you turn on the TV these days, often we're not even waiting for the other person to talk. We're just plowing ahead with our own diatribe. And so we live in this era of kind of selfies and echo chambers and social media. And for me, it's critical to have a space where different people from different echo chambers who are not on your social media networks are able to exchange ideas, experiences, dialogue in real time in an environment. So that is my real focus, and whether that has led me to talking to jihadis or ISIS members, or more recently spending a few days with the Taliban in Afghanistan, you will often find yourself in a situation where you obviously don't agree with the group's ideology or theology, where you obviously find a lot of their practices abhorrent. But if we're going to get anywhere in this world as journalists, we have to all be able to understand the ideas, and we have to allow viewers to hear the different ideas and viewpoints out there, vile and repugnant though some might be. It's important to have them all listened to. And so I think that's really been what inspires me to pursue those kinds of interviews. And I think it's also what's led me to have a certain degree of success in being able to get interviews that others have not, particularly with someone like the Taliban, or a group like the Taliban, I should say. I think that, you know, if people sense that you're fair, which is not to say you are a fan, but you're fair, then they are more willing to talk to you. And traditionally, this was the role of journalists, is to be fair and travel the world, allowing people to get their stories on the record, however different their version of events may be from what we hear in America.
And can we dive into that just for a little bit? Because I don't think I will ever have the opportunity again to ask someone what it was like to be with the Taliban.
So, I mean, it was interesting. I think the civilians who we spent time with, who are kind of support the Taliban but are not rank and file, they were very hospitable towards us. We stayed in their house overnight. They gave us food. They had lots of questions for us. The women were very friendly. We obviously had to sleep in a separate part of the house with women and children. We couldn't be in the same area as our male colleague, an Afghan filmmaker, or as any of the men in the house. And they were gracious. And we had some interesting conversations with women in this clinic that we visited, where they talked about that their reality is sort of, Taliban, Afghan government, it doesn't really matter to them. What they're looking for is who can provide peace, who can provide some semblance of normalcy, who can provide basic services, who can provide justice. These are the things that are interesting to them, much more than any sort of like ideological motivations. And I think that's often the case with civilians, and that story often doesn't get told. The Taliban themselves were not friendly, unsurprisingly. I can say that they were polite. I mean, even polite's a stretch. I mean, they were not hostile, let's say. They tolerated us. They took us to see the things that we wanted to see. We had a list of things we asked them to show us, and they did. They gave us interviews. They asked us not to ask certain questions. There was one incident that some viewers, some of your listeners might remember if they saw the story, where at the end of the interview, this man, we wanted to do a walking shot on the street, and he's like, I can't walk with a woman. So I had to end up walking behind him, which, I mean, yes, is it galling? Absolutely. But like, you're with the Taliban. Okay. So, what do you expect? That's more or less what I expected. My focus was on trying to get the best material we could and get out of there safely. And actually, my biggest fear on the ground there was U.S. airstrikes, because we hadn't tipped off the U.S. military that we were going to be with the Taliban. And so that was a significant threat for us.
That's incredible. It'll take me a while to wrap my mind around the fact that you were here, and I have watched quite a bit, and it's unbelievable. I guess, with that, I mean, it must be a difficult thing to isolate, but I'm curious, what is the most challenging and difficult story to tell with everything that's going on in the world? I mean, what do you feel is so far from being closed, as a story?
Yeah.
And what needs attention?
The story that really weighs on me at the moment that is not getting enough coverage is the story of Muslim Uyghurs in China being put in internment camps by Chinese authorities who deem them to be extremists. They say that they are kind of re-education camps, but by some reports, there are millions of people living in what some are calling effective concentration camps. And it is essentially impossible to get anywhere near the camps, get any access inside the camps. My colleague at CNN, Matt Rivers, just did an extraordinary series of reports from up in this area, Xinjiang area, province, where he was trying to get close to the camps. But the story inevitably became about Chinese authorities trying to prevent him from doing his job and travel to these places and report freely. It's incredibly distressing to me that this could be happening in this day and age. It's incredibly distressing to me to see leaders of Muslim countries like Pakistan coming out and saying that they don't know anything about the camps, or Saudi Arabia saying that China has the right to do what it wants to its Uyghur population if it deems them to be an extremist threat. So I think that's a story that weighs on me in terms of it's clearly so significant, it's so widespread, it's a huge thing, and yet there's so little we really know or can see of it. More broadly speaking, the story now is the story of politics, both in the US and definitely here in Europe too, where I'm based. And I think there's been a migration to both sides of the political spectrum. And it manifests itself in a number of different ways. But it's always tough with politics to tell the story in a way that is visual and rich and human. There's a tendency often when covering politics to sort of either resort to language that is dehumanizing, or to resort to language that is so political in its nature that one forgets it has anything to do with actually the lives of real men and women across the world. And so I spend a lot of time trying to like noodle over how can we tell these stories in ways where they're not just about political jargon, but they're about like people, which is ultimately what they are about. And I haven't come up with the perfect answer yet. So I'll get back to you if I do, but that's definitely something that I think about a lot, and trying to bring it down to a human level, because I think a lot of people are so alienated from the discourse, and yet the things that are being discussed and the issues, they're vital and important to ordinary people's lives, but they're so turned off by the conversation that, you know, there need to be other ways to tell the stories and make it vivid and real to people.
No, I fully agree. And I'll be watching wholeheartedly when you figure that out, because that is something I feel we are in desperate need of. I fully agree. And then I'm going to turn to something, you know, a little lighter now that you're a mom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doing all of this stuff. I mean, I'm a heavily traveling mom. I'm a single mom. I get it.
Yeah.
How has things changed, I guess, or also you alluded to it before, you know, you don't want to be in as much risk, you know, as maybe you would have before. But I guess the evolution of your journey into motherhood, and how has it impacted your career positively or giving you extra challenges that you have to overcome?
You know, first of all, here's something that no one tells you when you're having a baby.
Oh, there's a lot of things.
I mean, there's so many things. And people tell you, they're like, oh, you know, those first few months can be really tough. You're going to be really hormonal and you know, da, 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 da. No one tells you that, like, it's all really tough. It's so hard. And that doesn't mean you don't love your child more than anything in the world, and that they are not the greatest source of joy and love in your universe. But it flips your life upside down and challenges you in ways that you have never even imagined were possible. It forces you to confront your selfishness. It forces you to make tough choices. It forces you to slow down, to be in the moment, to listen. And it's hard, and it can be a grind, right? I mean, especially if you're working, it's so many hours and you're exhausted and you're thinking, I need to sleep, but I want to, you know, be present. And that's the most important thing. And how can I travel? And how do I negotiate this? And how do I navigate that? And how do I also be a good wife? And how can I be a good friend? And the reality is, whoever came up with the idea of you can have it all was lying. Okay.
I say
you
balance
cannot.
is BS. I say it all the time. Nope. It's whatever you make it. You know?
Exactly. And you're always going to be dropping the ball a little bit on one thing. Okay. And whether that's your social life, or being a good friend, or being a good wife, or being a good mom sometimes, or being good at your job, like, it is impossible to have all four balls up in the air successfully at all times. I really believe that. And I don't think we help women by telling them, like, you got this, it's easy, you know, lean in, you can do it. And that, you know, man, it takes a village. Okay.
Yeah.
And, like, you know, women who are like myself are privileged enough to have, like, a nanny who is, you know, there day in, day out, committed to helping you bring up your child, have it a lot easier than most. But the reality is that for any of us, it's hard. It's hard work. And I don't think women give themselves enough credit for doing the hardest job of all, which I had heard this said before, but I just thought, like, oh, it's like kind of one of those trite things you say, but it's so true. There is no harder job than being a mom. There is no harder job. It is the hardest thing you will ever do. It is also the most rewarding and beautiful and profound thing you will ever do. But it has been a process.
Coming from a woman on hormones on a regular basis, that's an incredibly impactful statement.
Oh my gosh, no. Embedding with the Taliban, so much easier than being a mom. So much easier. Because look, when you're a mom, you suddenly are confronted with, I have several things, but primarily you love someone else much more than you love yourself. And that changes there's a paradigm shift. And your focus and your priority changes. Now, that doesn't mean you have to, I believe as well, to be a good mother, also be realistic and about who you are, and have deep levels of self-knowledge, and understand what your fundamental nature is in terms of your needs regarding work, regarding uh, you know, if you are the woman who absolutely needs to have that high power job, then you need to have it. And I see women sometimes say to themselves, no, I want to be a mom and I want to devote all my efforts to that. And then their kids get to 5 or 6, and there's a real identity crisis that can happen there. Similarly, if you're a mother who thinks this is not even a conversation, I want to devote myself to bringing up my child, to midwifing this soul into the world, then that's what you got to do too. So you have to know yourself. And I think I'm had the benefit of being an older mother. I was 39 when my son was, no, 38. I'm like getting my own age mixed up. 38 when my son was born. And so I feel like I did have that level of self-knowledge. I knew that not going back to work would not be an option for me. But I also knew that it would change the way I do my work in some ways, whether it's taking a little bit less risk, whether it's a kind of focus shift. I definitely have found that my heart is sort of open and out there. And as a result, I find it very hard when I'm covering certain stories not to be emotional. Now, I can't see a child suffer any longer. I never had a very high threshold for that anyway. But after being a mother, it becomes almost like agonizing to even watch that. So things do change and they do shift, and that's okay. That's part of this, beautiful journey we call life, and everything is changing and moving and shifting and developing and growing. But I don't think we help other women by saying, oh, don't worry, you'll have the baby. You might feel a bit funny for a few months, but then it'll be great. You'll go back to work and everything will be fine. It's like, no, this is going to turn your world upside down in the best way possible.
You said that because not enough people do that. No, people don't tell you the truth. It's exactly right. And, and I think you figure it out as you go,
yes.
And I think for me
yes.
too, not working was never an option. It's like I spent a lot of time building things and they don't just go away. But you're such an incredible example of anybody who can do it. I mean, the fact that you're balancing such incredibly different worlds is kind of a bit inspirational. And where do you go next? I mean, what's on your agenda? What do you, aside from finding the political solution, how to deliver more human stories? I mean, what's on the agenda?
So I have a couple of really interesting sort of the stories that I tend to gravitate towards that I love doing often take months and months to plan and can be very frustrating, can be very difficult. So I'm currently working on two big stories, one involving Russia, another one involving Saudi Arabia. I can't really say more than that at the moment, but they are taking a lot of time and effort, but they're really interesting stories. And I think there are two countries that are absolutely the major players, with the exception of the obvious, the US and China and Iran. So I think they're looking at the sort of international perspective and the stories that are important this year, especially as the US is preparing to go into an election next year. And some of these issues have tentacles back to the US and politics at home. So these are two areas that I'm very interested in and very fascinated by. But I do tend to sort of get myself into these stories and I put the bar up here and then realize very quickly that it's almost impossible to meet that bar. and then spend like months and months and months stressing out about how I can try to at least approach it. And it requires a team, because television is 100% teamwork. And I'm very lucky to work with an extremely gifted producer called Selma Abdulaziz, who's done many trips with me to Syria, to Afghanistan with the Taliban. And she's brilliant. And and we work very hard together to try to think of stories that are both important geopolitically and significant, but also are going to resonate with ordinary people who maybe aren't following every single article in the New York Times, because that's very important to me, is that ordinary people who aren't news junkies also are happening upon these stories, finding them interesting, learning something from them, arming themselves with the information that they need to make decisions, that affect their lives.
Yeah, just the way stories are being told is so incredibly different even from a couple of years ago. And you do a wonderful job. So thank you for all
Thank
that you
you.
do to educate people and to bring people the truth, really. And your work does not go unnoticed.
Thank
It
you
is
so
heavily
much.
appreciated by millions, I'm sure. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate it. And I cannot wait to see where your journeys take you next.
Thank you
Thank you.
so much. And thank you for doing this. I think it's important. I can't wait to watch the others. And I really appreciate you having me on.
Thank you.